where most of our work has ever been. So here are some of our clients. You can see in terms of education, SREB over on the left, that was the Southern Region Educational Board in the US. And there they carried out a small experiment to see what happens when you put, they called it what happens when you put teachers in the driving seat for their own professional development. What happens? And so the teachers were invited into a community of practice and asked to work out among themselves through a series of activities, what do we need to know? What can we do for professional development, both for ourselves, for our students, for our schools? It was in a very poor district in the US, and it was a very thriving community of practice.
It was interesting because, when teachers were actually in charge of their own professional development with each other, there was very little talk about curriculum. A lot of the talk was about classroom culture, school culture, relationship with parents. Actually, there was a group there in the community that decided to organize a fair, a school fair, to invite parents in so that they can improve their relationship with the parents, because for them, that was really what needed learning from a professional perspective. And for them, being in a community of practice where they were in charge of their own professional development, then was really an illustration of the formative power of this community. But it's worth mentioning that this approach of having practitioners drive their own learning has been used not just in education, that was just one example, but it's been used in business, in this big international bank. Anybody who wants to start a community of practice on something they're interested in can propose it on the community of practice website, make sure that there are enough people interested. If 2 people who want to take leadership, then poof, the community of practice is supported by the organization. So there, I would say that the community of practice are very much used to give employees a sense that what they care about matters. And if they care about a new language, it's mostly among technologists in that like a new language that having a new approach to software development, they can create a community of practice. So they feel that they are not just a peon giving jobs, but that what they think and what they are interested in matters to the organization.
In the Singapore government, they recognize that they have many silos within government in the civil service. So nobody talked to each other. And so they created a community of practice among the civil servants in order that they would talk to each other in order to be able to give a better service to their clients, the citizens.
So just to give you a sense of the scope of this new approach to learning, I mean, new in the sense that it is different from what has traditionally become learning, which is, universities, lectures, and books, and so on and so forth. But it is actually as old as humankind. People have learned this way. I don't know, since we were in a cave discussing why the bear escaped and what we should do better next time to make sure that we catch that bear. So we're talking about something that is profoundly human and profoundly a part of why the human species has been so successful on our planet. Of course, successful at maybe destroying the planet, but it's another problem. But in terms of building a civilization, this ability to develop practices together is probably one of the crucial differentiations of our species.
And yet, we tend to relegate this kind of learning to the coffee breaks or to the evening glass of wine, rather than making it front and center of the learning event.
And if you think of that kind of learning, then the way that we talk about it is under 3 conditions. The first condition is that you come to the learning because you care to make a difference. You don't come there to pass an exam, you don't come there to get a good grade. You come there because you care to make a difference, something that matters to you.
And you're also there engaging your uncertainty. You're there because of what you don't know. You're not there because of what you do know. What you do know may be very important, but you're in the space because of what you don't know. And so the learning is driven by what you don't know.
And so this is pushed by caring to make a difference, then engaging what you don't know, and then listening carefully, paying really attention to what happens when you are in this engagement. And you see, you may think, oh, yeah, of course you listen. But to really listen when something new is happening, sometimes it's as much unlearning as it is learning. Sometimes it's as much accepting the impossible when it is presented. So, paying attention when you really want to make a difference, and a group of people is engaging their uncertainty around how to make a difference, is a key element of this type of learning. Anyway, these 3 conditions for social learning, which then translate into our sort of operational definition of a community of practice.
So a community of practice, people come together and they do stuff together because they want to make a difference. In the middle, they enjoy being with others who understand the difference that they want to make. They're able to talk about their uncertainty. You can't talk about your uncertainty and about the sort of very small decisions you have to make unless it's with people who understand the difference that you want to make.
Then, out of this mutual engagement come ideas, new perspective, maybe increased confidence in what you're doing so that you can convince your boss to try something important. All sorts of stuff come out of that mutual engagement.
And so far so good. We could actually almost be talking about traditional learning situations. But for us, it's only half the story. For learning in a community of practice, as learningful as what is happening with your peers, is what you do with your ideas, what you do with your new confidence, when you go back home and put it into practice or back to your job. Because putting something into practice is not simply applying research or a theory or a framework or a tool unproblematically. You are being a little entrepreneurial about it. You're waiting for the right time. You're adapting it so that it works in your context. So there is a lot of learning that happens when you actually do something with an insight that you got, or when you do something with the research that you learned.
And so, having tried something new, you observe what happens. Does it make a difference? Does it improve things? The flowers bloom, or does it ruin things? The flowers don't bloom, actually they die, you know? So learning, there's no a priori saying that learning is going to lead to something successful. But, successful or unsuccessful, if you belong to a community of practice, what is really important is bring that back to the community. Say, okay, I tried this that we discussed last week. I tried it this way and I tried it this way, and it worked very well. Or I tried it this way and that way, and it was a real problem. We need to rethink that. So, the idea of a community of practice is creating that loop between practice and engagement in mutual learning.
So the learning treasure of a community of practice is the story of what people are doing in practice and what is happening as a result. So that is where stories of what happens, of what you did with an idea and what happens as a result, and telling that story to your peers, to your learning partners, that is, in a way, the curriculum.
And these stories, we call them value creation stories. These stories have a genre that goes from, what it felt like to be together, to what you got, to what you tried, to what happened. And some communities learn to tell these genres of story as a kind of learning mode with each other. We see some communities that open any meeting, saying, anybody has a value creation story about what we discussed in the past? And they learn to share with each other what happened in their practice that way. So, from a pedagogical perspective here, a key insight is this notion of loop. That learning does not stop when you pass your exam or when you get an idea. That you need to support and facilitate this kind of loop.
And actually, I've got a story of a training organisation who didn't use communities of practice, but used this idea of loops in a very interesting way. They ran traditional training courses. It's the Centre of Excellence in Finance in Ljubljana in Slovenia. And they held regular training courses. They had people from the International Monetary Fund come and teach them. But they hired a person whose job it was to follow up 1 week later and 6 months later with the people who had done the course to find out very specific stories of what they had taken from the course, what they had done with it in practice, and what had happened as a result, whether it was a success or a failure. And those stories were recorded either on video or by hand, and those stories were brought back to the next training course. So when they taught this, they also included more and more stories from past people who were working for their governments in the area of finance. They brought those stories back about what had worked and what hadn't worked. And sometimes actually they even brought some of those participants back to tell the story themselves. But so that was an interesting mix. There was no community of practice, but they took the idea of loops very seriously. Because with those stories, you don't want a general success story. You want really very small stories of very tiny things that people did in their practice.
And so, as we said earlier, more recently, we are often involved in learning situations where there are multiple practices, and when you need a bit of time to say, hey, I'm a doctor, you are an administrator. Do I really want to spend time, waste my time with you? I'm not interested in your administration, and you don't understand anything about my being a doctor. How much time do we want to spend together? But we have seen communities, for instance in medicine, communities of practice that were addressing a problem that could not be solved by a single community. Like an example is a surgeon, a coniugi surgeon, who put together a community around pulmonary, lung disease, with the idea that it took way too long for a patient from diagnosis to being treated in the university hospital. They brought together administrators, surgeons, radiologists, doctors in a countryside who were sending people. And in the beginning, these people always said, oh yeah, it's too slow because of them. It's too slow because of them. It took a while for them to say, okay, now, let's stop blaming each other. Let's really look at our practice, reflect on how our practice influences other practices, and let's start to develop a new way of working that would get the patient to the hospital sooner. And actually they were able to decrease the time to treatment very, very substantially from months to a couple of weeks.
And saving lives.
Yeah. And so, when you try to do that, when you deal with a landscape of different practices to develop the learning capability in that landscape, things get a little bit more complicated.
Because in a landscape you have various things, we call it systems, you have things that are already designed, you have laws, you have rules, you have bureaucracy, you have organizations, you have things that are pre-designed that you have to follow. At the same time, you also have what people actually do, right? Their practices. People always have little workarounds to bureaucracy, to the structures, to the rules. There are many little workarounds, but those workarounds are important. So the systems are important, the design things. Also the practices, what people actually do, are important. And the third one, relationships. People. People have a tendency to always get in the way. But people, relationships between people.
Oh, it helps. It's not necessarily not. I mean, it does get in there, but sometimes it helps to have a good relationship with someone who is in another practice and say, hey, we need to talk. And because of that relationship, you're able to bring people together who normally would not talk to each other.
So in learning across multiple practices and systems, you have a lot of moving parts.
And there are issues of power. Doctors in the hospital or oncology professors have more power than a little doctor in a little village somewhere. And yet they need to learn to talk to each other, respecting each other's practice fully, by understanding that in your practice, you are applying your intelligence just as much as I'm implying my intelligence in mine.
And boundaries and identities. People, if you're a radiologist, speaking to a pathologist, you have a different language. You've come through in different ways. You see the world in a different way. And you need to be able to create productive conversations across that.
And sometimes part of your identity is to be convinced that these people are idiots, And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but in fact, often in a community, part of your identity is a stereotypical judgment of other people in other communities. And that can really be an obstacle to learning that you need to work through in order to create this kind of landscape-wide learning capabilities.
But in terms of learning, in terms of assessing learning, it starts to get more complicated when you get to a landscape. Because in a community of practice, competence is judged in a way by how far you have moved up the hill. If your practice is being a doctor, then the longer you've been in, the more other doctors respect you, the more papers perhaps that you publish, the more you're deemed more competent. But when you're in a landscape, it's much harder to say what's good or what's not good, because being in a landscape means being aware of other people's practices. It means being aware of the systems at play. We call that knowledgeability, but our theory really does fall very short in terms of assessment of learning in a landscape, because it is very important. It's a high competence in a way, which is to be able to read a landscape, to be able to know how to do multiple things.
Because it's like how much about administration and accounting do you need to know to interact meaningfully with an administrator if you are a doctor? How much time do you want to spend understanding their practice? But you have to have some understanding of what they're doing, otherwise you cannot engage with them. And this relationship to a landscape is what we call knowledgeability.
And you could see that, for example, with doctors, with new things coming up, like molecular tumors or the DNA of tumors, nobody quite knows what we should be doing about that. So you have to bring together people who don't normally speak to each other, like the radiologists, like the nurses, like the leaders, like the oncological people, like the people specialists in genetic testing. And now they have to know enough about each other's practice to be able to have a productive conversation whereby they learn together how to know what to do when somebody has a tumor that is genetic. We don't know how to do it.
And
So
we
have
think,
to learn how to do it.
we think that this concept has actually a lot of implications for education. Because often things in education are presented as facts, but not in the context of a landscape of practice. I don't know, our students maybe learn that the universe is 13 billion something years old, which is very short from my perspective to give rise to everything that we see on the earth. But anyway, the reason this is a fact is because a certain community with certain tools and certain capabilities has come with that conclusion. It's not something that you can derive from your own experience. And you know, there are competing versions in the southern United States. There are people who think it's 6,000 years old, because if you look at in the Bible and you count the generations, you don't get to 13 billion, you get to about 6,000. And so there are, if you look at the landscape, there are competing versions of what counts as facts. And I think it's very important to help our students make sense of the landscape. Especially today, where through misinformation, through access to the internet, the competing pillars of what it means to know are much more subtle and important to understand. You know, I remember my son was once kind of saying, I was telling him that I like to read the New York Times to get my news. And he was saying, but don't you know that the New York Times is a for-profit company, and all they're interested in is giving you the kind of stuff you like to read so that you pay your subscription. True. It's a good point. But when I asked him, so where do you get your news? He said, well, I get my news from Facebook, because on Facebook, we don't have this limitation of a for-profit company. Well, there is a for-profit company. But in his mind, it was like a free-for-all. It was not under the guidance of someone who was trying to make a profit. And I can see his point, but for me, my understanding of the landscape that helped me make my choice is that I think the New York Times, if they say something wrong, there are lots of people who are going to punish them. So, because of my understanding of the landscape, I tend to trust the New York Times more than I trust Facebook. It doesn't mean that the New York Times is always right. But I would say that my personal understanding of the landscape makes me make that choice. But I think it's going to be so important for our students in the future to make a choice of that kind. And I'm not saying that all the students should start reading the New York Times. That's not my point. My point is that introducing our students into a landscape of practice where there are competing versions of what counts as knowledge is going to be as important for their future well-being and for the well-being of society as giving them the right knowledge. So this is one of the implications of this learning theory for education. So, Are we going?
It's always my job telling you to speed up.
So, if we think of knowledgeability as a relationship to a landscape, what are the key insights to take from a pedagogical perspective?
There are three interlocking things. One is imagination. We need to be able to stimulate people's imagination to the big picture.
To what's happening elsewhere, where you don't have access, but you have to still know. So imagination here is not fantasy. Imagination is creating an image of the world in such a way that who you are makes sense.
And then there's also engagement. People need to feel engaged in what is happening. They need to participate and engage. They're not passive, they need to engage.
And they need to engage in a way that aligns with certain requirements in the world. And actually, this beautiful cathedral here, that you may recognize, was built by people who were cutting stones and building the monument. And there's this story of the three stone cutters on the side of the road, and one person came by and said, "So, what are you doing?" And the person said, "Look, I'm cutting a stone. Look how well I'm cutting it. It's going to be perfectly flat because I have years of experience with my hammer to make it perfectly flat." And the second one said, "Listen, I was told to make this stone exactly 1 meter by 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter. And I'm going to do it perfectly to this measurement because that's what my foreman told me to do." And the third one said, "What are you doing?" "I'm building a cathedral." And you can see that those three dimensions of learning are important together. Because if you don't know you're building a cathedral, and your foreman tells you to make a stone, I don't know, 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters or 30 centimeters, you're going to go like, "Wait a minute. I know what we're trying to do. This doesn't seem right." So having the big picture is very important to make sure that your alignment is right. But if you don't know how to handle a chisel, you are also useless. So you can see how the three things are necessary for engaging in the world with understanding. And so we would like to leave you with the challenge. If you think of your students, how do you ensure that mix? Because they're going to need all three. And it's going to be your pedagogical responsibility to nurture these three dimensions of their relationship to the world.
So we finish with where we are now, which is learning to make a difference. We have developed a framework where we talk about the different value that is created in making that difference and how we get closer to making that difference and learn in the process of creating that value.
What value that people get from their learning interactions?
But I think probably the most important thing that comes out of this work that we're doing now is that learning with agency is different from learning without agency. So as you're learning, if you feel that with that learning you can make a difference, is different from learning because one day this will serve you. And right now, it gives you no sense of agency. So the idea of agency has become central to our theory now.
And for education, the implication is beware of viewing learning as a transmission of a curriculum. Because if you only view learning as a transmission of a curriculum, it doesn't matter if there is agency or not. As long as they pass the exam and the curriculum has made it into their head, we've done our job. We are saying there's something more. There's something more here about learning. And it has to do with agency. It has to do with learning to make a difference.
So, yeah, we leave you with our last slide. Is really the gears around there is to not leave you with the impression that we only care about communities of practice in a way. We care deeply. What gets us up in the morning is that we are developing the learning capability, really, of us as a species, through individuals, through groups, through whatever means possible. But it's important for our survival, and communities of practice are one way of doing it. There are other ways as well. So we just want to say that we have other ways that we are developing social learning capability.
And now we are starting a social learning lab in Portugal, where we are trying to help people embrace those concepts and those practices.
So thank you very much, everybody.